Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. So here it is, the first next generation device. This is the PowKiddy X18S. This device has an 8-core CPU, 4 gigs of RAM, 5.5-inch 720p display with a touchscreen. It runs Android 11, has 5 GHz Wi-Fi, and a hefty battery too. And these are excellent specs, better than anything we've ever seen before that runs under $200. Right now, this device retails for $173, and you can find discounts here and there as well. And up until this point, we've never seen anything at this price with this much power in a dedicated retro handheld device. And let me tell you what that power actually means. In addition to playing those classic games beautifully, you can also run PSP at 720p resolution. And same deal with the Nintendo 64. Every game I tried played really well. And, as expected, the same story with Dreamcast. You can play any of these systems up to the screen resolution of 720p, and they look great. And thanks to the extra power we have in this device, it can actually play about half of the GameCube library. And, thanks to that 5 GHz Wi-Fi connection and the Android backend, you can easily stream things like Stadia or your Xbox directly onto this device. So what would be holding me back from saying this is the greatest device ever? Well, there are quite a few caveats. Already, we're seeing lots of reports about the build quality of this device. Specifically, the D-pad travel is way too shallow, the analog sticks are way too sensitive, the face buttons press down too far, they go flush with the device when you push down on them. And finally, despite having pretty good shoulder buttons, the trigger buttons themselves, the L2 and R2, leave a lot to be desired. And so my purpose behind this video is to do a deep dive review. I want to show whether or not the performance and the power of this device are equal to or greater than the shoddy build quality of the device itself. Because yes, you can absolutely play all of the 5th generation game consoles as well as some of the 6th generation ones as well. But the question is, if you have a device with bad controls, are you even going to want to play those games? So we have a ton of ground to cover, and I expect this to be quite a long video, so buckle up and let's get to it. Alright, as always, we'll start with an unboxing. I'll spare you some of the gory details, but let me show you what it looks like coming out of the box. It comes with a USB-C cable, same one as you typically would see from PowKiddy, and it also has an instruction manual that I highly recommend you completely ignore. And so here we are with the moment of truth. Now the X18S is actually the 2nd generation of clamshell devices from PowKiddy. Its predecessor was called the X18, and it was much lower powered, but it was in a nicer looking black. Overall, when it comes to design, not a lot has changed. You have 2 speakers here in the front, as well as a headphone jack. And on the top, you have shoulder and trigger buttons. The shoulder buttons actually feel pretty good. They have a good amount of travel to them, and they don't have a lot of clickiness to them. They do feel pretty good. Now, these trigger buttons are a different story. These are pretty terrible. They're extremely clicky and have almost zero travel. And it's kind of a shame, because the shoulder buttons are pretty good, and I wish they had done the same with the trigger buttons here. Finishing out the top here, we have a USB-C port which works for both charging as well as data, a mini HDMI port, and a microSD slot. And that's about it for the exterior. Let's do some weight comparisons. 310 grams is pretty heavy. Compare that to something like an RGB10 Max, or a PS Vita, or even the metal RG351MP, it's still heavier than each of these. It's about 50 grams heavier than my kid's Nintendo 2DS. In fact, the only non-metal device that I have that's heavier than that is the GPD XD Plus. But yeah, at 310 grams, it seems like it's a very heavy device. But what you have to bear in mind is that a clamshell device actually distributes the weight pretty well once you actually have the device open. So unlike a metal device, it doesn't feel like a brick. It actually feels fairly comfortable. At 310 grams, you might think it's heavy, but honestly, that's not a thought that crossed my mind. In terms of overall size, the best comparison is the GPD XD Plus, but not many people have this device, so that's not a great comparison. Let's try something else. How about the Nintendo 2DS? Obviously, many more people have this device, and it is quite a bit shorter than the X18S. Now compare that against a non-clamshell, something like the RG351MP, and it's quite a bit bigger. And of course, we're kind of getting into apples and oranges here. Literally, the RGB10 Max is longer and shorter and thinner than the X18S. There's really no comparing the two. They kind of serve 2 different purposes. In terms of thickness, I would say it's about as thick as the bottom of an RG351V. It feels like it's a good solid inch of thickness. Compare that to something like the thinner PS Vita, the 2000 version, and it's night and day. But again, bear in mind that when you open up a clamshell device, that's the part you're actually going to be holding. And so in that case, it's actually not that much thicker than something like a PS Vita. Overall, I would say this is actually quite a portable device. It's obviously not something that's inconspicuous, you couldn't throw that in your pocket and not notice it, but at the same time, it's definitely portable, it's something that you can just grab and go. And honestly, I think that's a pretty good fit for what it does. And, I really do like clamshell devices, it protects the screen as you're carrying it about. And just to give you a highlight of pocketability in a real-life situation, here's me standing in our front yard, and this is what it looks like when you put it in your shorts pocket. I don't think it would fit in some tighter jeans, but if you're wearing shorts or something similar, then it's fine. Okay, so now let's open it up and take a look at what we have when we actually play the device. First thing you're probably going to notice is the big wasted space here in the middle. And I think that our eyes have basically been trained to expect a second screen on a device like that. And so sure, it looks like wasted space, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to reach and press anything in the center of the device anyway. So it is what it is. So let's talk about the actual controls themselves. We'll start with the analog sticks. Like I mentioned in the intro, these things are a little bit too sensitive. Immediately when you touch them with your finger, you're going to be able to tell that they don't provide enough resistance. It's not a very pleasant experience. Additionally, they do not click down, so there is no L3 and R3 on this device. Overall, not impressed with the analog sticks. Let's move over to the D-pad now. The biggest issue that people are having with the D-pad is the lack of travel. The fact is, when you push down on this rubber membrane connection, it's very difficult to tell whether or not you're pushing down all the way. Part of that comes from the fact that the D-pad sits flush with the device when you push down on it. It doesn't give you the tactile feedback that you would expect when you're playing a game. Unfortunately, this is an unpleasant experience to me. I don't like the fact that this D-pad goes so far down. Things like diagonals are going to be basically impossible on this D-pad. It's almost as if they just needed to push the D-pad up a little bit more so that you had better travel. What I wish they had done is use stiffer rubber membranes. Not only that, the D-pad itself is tiny. It's 18.17 millimeters. It's actually smaller than what you would find on the Nintendo 2DS. And it doesn't stop there. It's smaller than the PS Vita and much smaller than something like an Anbernic device. And that's kind of a shame because we have lots of space to work with here. It would have been better if they had a larger D-pad. And on my unit, the left part of the D-pad tends to stick every once in a while. Overall, I don't think they sized this D-pad correctly for the hole. Listen to this when I push down on it. To me, that's an indication that we're working with a bad D-pad. Overall, if I was grading this D-pad, I would give it a D. It's not a solid F because it is controllable, but at the same time, it is not a pleasant experience. Alright, let's move over to the face buttons now. The main complaint I've heard about these is very similar to the D-pad. They press down too far. And I tend to agree with that. When you push down on these buttons, they do sit flush with the device. Again, that's not giving you the tactile feedback that you're going to expect when playing a game. I do think that the buttons are responsive enough. They do bounce up quite well. And I get it, they probably need to use shallow buttons because they don't want it pressing against the screen of the clamshell, but all the same, I wish they had used stiffer rubber membranes. Let's do a comparison of other devices and their controls. Here's the GPD XD Plus. This device was actually gifted to me by a viewer, but unfortunately I never got around to doing a review because the device just never really resonated with me. It just wasn't quite powerful enough for what I was looking for. But one of the things about this device is it has much better build quality than the X18S. To me, this is a well-made D-pad. It gives you enough travel and pivot that you can use diagonals, and you get enough tactile feedback to know when you're pressing down on it. The analog stick is almost exactly the same as the X18S. It is too sensitive and also doesn't click down. Moving over to the face buttons, they have that same tactile feedback as the D-pad. As you can see, they don't sit flush with the device. They're responsive, and they're just overall pretty good. Honestly, if the PowKiddy X18 Plus had this D-pad or these face buttons, I would be much happier with the device. Not only that, they got around the lack of L3 and R3 by making separate buttons for them. So in this sense, I think that the XD Plus is superior when it comes to controls. The shoulder buttons on this are clicky, but they are fairly responsive, and the trigger buttons are responsive as well. I don't like these shoulder buttons as much as the PowKiddy ones, but the trigger buttons are definitely better. Okay, now let's test out the Nintendo DS. My kids have a superpower of making this device dirty at all times, so I apologize for the dirtiness of the device, but let's talk about the D-pad. As you can see, the D-pad doesn't have any travel to it either, but that's because it's a clicky D-pad. When you push down on this, you get immediate tactile feedback. Same thing with the face buttons. These are definitely clicky controls, but they're also soft and responsive. This is a really good combination when it comes to clickier controls. This is something the Retroid Pocket 2 got wrong. They made theirs too stiff and hard to push down on. But something like this with a Nintendo product, you push down on them, they're clicky, but it's not a bad experience. If anything, it feels very precise. It's almost the same experience with the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons. You can push down on them, they're very clicky, they're a little bit loud, but at the same time there's never a question of whether or not you push down on the button. Unfortunately, that is a question when you're using the X18S. And that's not a good place to be in when you're playing a video game. Okay, let's talk about the other buttons on the face. We have a volume up and down, there's a screen button mapping function, power button, and then your 3 Android buttons, your list, home, and back. And on top of that, there are select and start buttons. Now the ironic thing about these buttons is that they are clicky, and they are actually responsive. If I had to choose between using clicky buttons like this or the buttons we have for the face buttons, I actually would prefer that the face buttons are clicky like the ones here. It's kind of frustrating when the home button is more responsive than the A button. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the screen here. This is a 5.5-inch IPS touch display with a 1280 by 720 resolution. And it's OCA laminated. It actually looks really good. This is one of the better screens I've ever seen on any handheld device. I'm honestly amazed that they got a nice screen on a device with this much power for this price. They really must have undercut their bottom line. As far as the clamshell function of this device, it actually has 2 different locations where it gets stuck. The first is this one here. This is kind of like what I'm considering the laptop style view. And to be honest, I've never found a time when I wanted to use it at this angle. Instead, I prefer to use the widest angle possible. And this is a hard stop here. It doesn't go any wider than this. It is a fairly comfortable angle, but there are times when I wish it went just a little bit further back. But unfortunately, as you see here, it does not go back any further, and it doesn't give that much give either. Now let's compare it against some other devices. Here's the Nintendo 2DS. As you can see, it has a wider angle. On top of that, it's a little bit more forgiving when you try to open it up a little bit more. And that makes sense because this is supposed to be a more kid-friendly device. We had similar behavior with the Nintendo DS Lite. This also had a wider angle and also had a single click to it. And the GPD XD Plus is actually the clear winner here. This one opens up to basically 180 degrees. Okay, I think that's enough for hardware for a minute. Let's actually talk about the software. Let's boot up this device and see what we're working with. Now, this is an Android device, which means it's going to take a while to boot up. And the ROM they've installed on this is a version of Android 11 customized by PowKiddy themselves. But luckily, it's fairly easy to tweak yourself, which we'll do here in this video. Overall, as you can see, it takes about 33 seconds to boot up. And this is the custom interface that they've created. And honestly, I'm not a big fan. It comes with Happy Chick and QQ already installed. These are apps that allow you to illegally download games onto your device. We're not going to use any of those apps. In fact, we're not going to use much of what's available within this firmware. There's actually a couple routes we can go. The first thing we can do is update the firmware. This is going to allow us to run the Google Play Store, and we'll also have bug fixes for things like their HDMI output. But secondly, there is custom firmware in the works for this device. The developer Black Seraph has been working on a custom version of Lineage OS for the X18S. He's also created other firmwares for the GPD Android devices. And just in the first 5 days of owning this device, he already has a version that's working pretty well. As of today, it's not been released to the public yet, but I expect to see it here pretty soon. And this will probably run faster and better than the current operating system. But for now, let's work with what we've got. First thing I'm going to do is insert an SD card into the device. And we have quite a few options when it comes to the SD card storage as well. First thing you want to do is swipe down from the top and select the SD card setup. And you have 2 options here. You can set it up for tablet or adoptable storage, or you can use it for portable storage. Let me talk a little bit about each of these. With adoptable storage, it basically expands the internal storage of the device itself. And this is helpful with Android 11 because some apps can't actually read the data that's on an external SD card. But there are some downsides. For example, if you flash a new firmware, it's going to make that SD card unusable. On the other hand, if you use portable storage, you can eject the SD card and put it into your PC and transfer files that way. But the issue is that many apps on Android 11 cannot access those files. So you'll either have to transfer them over to the limited internal storage, or you'll have to use special workarounds in order to access those files. It's up to you what kind of pain you want to go through. I've tried both styles, and honestly, I'm currently using the tablet or adoptable storage method. This allows me to share the data between the internal storage and the SD card. But I'm going into this knowing that I'm going to lose everything when I flash a new firmware, and I'm okay with that. But if you're just getting started, I would recommend trying out the portable storage option. It's going to be the less intrusive of the options, and you'll be able to transfer files over directly onto the SD card. But if you don't want to do that, let me show you how to transfer files directly onto the device from your computer. First thing you want to do is plug a USB cable into your computer and then into the device itself. Then pull down from the top and you'll see something that says Android system charging this device via USB. Click on that option and then select Media Device MTP File Transfer. On your computer, you're going to see a pop-up that'll allow you to access both the internal shared storage as well as the SD card. And updating the firmware is super easy. Just go to the PowKiddy.com website, click on the banner to get to the latest firmware updates, and then download the update. It's a little over a gig, so give yourself time to download that. From there, all you have to do is drag that update.zip file either onto the SD card or the internal storage of the device. From there, go back onto your device, go into the advanced settings, and scroll down to the About Tablet section. There you're going to see something that says Local Software Update. Click on that and then confirm that you are going to update and lose your data. And then it'll show either SD update or internal update, and then hit OK one last time. And that's about it. It's going to take a minute to load up the software itself, and then it'll ask you if you want to install it, and you say, yeah man, I want to do it. Altogether, this process will take about 20 minutes, and when you're done with it, it's going to make you set up the device as if it's brand new all over again. And setting this up is much like any other Android phone or tablet. You go in and set your Wi-Fi, you can set your wallpaper, and everything else. Once it's done, it's going to greet you with this ugly PowKiddy screen again. But if you go into My Apps, you can see you now have the Google Play Store. And even if your device comes with the Google Play Store, I recommend updating to the most recent firmware version as soon as you get it. Like I showed you, it's super easy. Anyway, once you have access to the Google Play Store, go ahead and install whatever apps you want. I'm going to install a combination of games and launchers and emulators. When it comes to launchers, I'm going to choose ATV Launcher Pro. This is a $3 app that basically turns all of your apps into tiles. It makes it much easier to navigate. If you hold your finger down on any app, it's going to open up the sidebar on the right. You can select Launcher Settings, then Hidden Apps. Within here, you can hide whatever apps you don't want to actually see on your home screen. It won't uninstall them, but it'll just make it a little bit cleaner looking. Additionally, there's a Move section here, so you can move around your apps however you'd like. Personally, I like to show all my emulators first, then the Android games and streaming options and things like that. It's really going to be up to you. But in general, these are the apps I'm going to use in my testing. I'm going to use RetroArch for all the classic games, and then standalone emulators for things like PSP, Nintendo 64, and so on. Okay, a couple more things before we actually start gaming. First, let's talk about the sleep function. And it does work. You can close the clamshell and it's going to put the device to sleep. And that's pretty handy. That being said, the sleep mode does drain the battery fairly quickly. This is definitely not something I would recommend for overnight use. But if you need to close it for a minute or two, or just for maybe an hour, I think that's going to be fine. But in general, when you're done playing the device, I recommend powering it down. Now the device has an HDMI function as well. Early firmware versions had a problem where it actually would cause screen burn-in, but they fixed that with the most recent update. So like I said, make sure that you update your firmware as soon as you get it. Either way, the HDMI function works pretty well. This could potentially allow you to use this as a mini console. You could hook up a couple controllers via Bluetooth and then play on a TV, and that's a pretty cool concept. At the very least, it's something to keep in mind if this is important to you. Okay, now let's actually get into the gaming part. We're going to start with RetroArch. Now, RetroArch has quite a few caveats with it when you first set it up. For example, the controls aren't going to work properly, so you're going to have to go into the input settings and map all of the buttons manually yourself. You only have to do this one time, but it is a pain in the butt. And once you've mapped everything, you can go into the configuration file section and then select Save Current Configuration. That'll save all your input controls from then on out. And like I mentioned, unless you do a workaround, RetroArch is not going to read the data on your SD card if you're using it for portable storage. So honestly, if you're using portable storage, I recommend moving those files over to your internal storage anyway. And that's because the systems that really shine on RetroArch are going to be the classic systems, and those game files are relatively small. So there's two major things I want to talk about with RetroArch when it comes to actually playing. The first is going to be the screen, and then we'll talk about controls. We'll start with the screen first. Here is the Anbernic RG351MP and the PowKiddy X18S. These are both using integer scaling. The first thing you'll probably notice is the X18S has a larger screen even when it's displaying a 4:3 display at integer scaling. The other thing you're probably going to notice is that the coloring seems to be a little bit off on the X18S. Compared to the RG351MP, it's a little bit more of a greener hue. Honestly, when you're just holding the device and playing it, it's not something you'll really notice, but it is something I wanted to call attention to in case color balance is really important to you. Of all the devices I own, I do think the RG351MP probably has the best color balance overall. To me, this seems to be the most accurate of the displays. That being said, the PowKiddy device isn't terrible. Now, here is the PowKiddy RGB10 Max. This device has a 5-inch screen, but as you can see, the 5.5-inch display on the device below actually gives you quite a bigger picture when it comes to 4:3 systems like this. I think in terms of color balance, the RGB10 Max is more saturated, but it is a bit dimmer of a display. The PowKiddy X18S is a nice, bright display. So now let's listen to a little bit of audio here. Overall, I think the audio is pretty good on this device. The bass isn't very rich, but the sound is pretty good. It's distinct in the high and the mid range. Now when it comes to controls, with RetroArch, I'm feeling some obvious input delay. And this is kind of a testament to me playing around with retro devices for the past year or so. I now can detect things like input lag, which I didn't feel when I first got, say, for example, the Retroid Pocket 2. But all in all, I'm feeling a delay when I'm playing this game. Now luckily, this processor is powerful enough that we can do something to fix it. If you go into settings and then latency, you can select run ahead to reduce latency. And I'm just going to keep the number of frames to 1. But even with a run ahead of 1, this feels so much better. In fact, it feels really good to play. This is one of the better RetroArch experiences I've had on a handheld, because the response is so good. Most of the devices I own cannot handle a run ahead like this, and because of that, this one just feels very responsive. I like it. So, across the board, I recommend using a run ahead of 1 on any of the systems that you're going to use in RetroArch. That little amount of latency correction is really significant when it comes to this device. I often hear about how bad input lag is on Android, and honestly, with this correction in place, it's not bad at all. I actually enjoy this. When it comes to gameplay, there's really not much to talk about. Everything plays perfectly. And setting up with integer scaling does allow you to have a very nice and big screen, but still having perfect pixels. So this is my recommendation if you're going to play RetroArch. Do it on integer scaling and put that run ahead on. After that, everything is going to look and play really well. So let's try some of the harder stuff. Let's start with PS1. This is running the standalone DuckStation emulator, and it's upscaled to 720p and running perfectly. And really, other than that, there's not a lot to talk about. This is running really well. So let's move on to some of the harder stuff. How about Sega Saturn? This is using the standalone Yabasan Shiro 2 emulator, and it's working really well too. This is also upscaled to 720p. A lot of your mid to upper tier games, things like Nights into Dreams and Panzer Dragoon, are running at full speed. The only one I ran into issues with was Sega Rally Championship. At 720p, I was detecting some slowdown as well as some audio stuttering. But if you just reduce the resolution to something like 2x instead of 720p, it runs perfectly. So overall, I would say Saturn is a big win on this device. Moving over to Nintendo DS, this is the Drastic standalone emulator. This is a paid emulator, but it works really well. One of the nice things about this is it shows you both screens at once if you want, and also you can use touchscreen controls. So really, not a lot of compromises when it comes to playing Nintendo DS games on this device. You can even upscale the resolution to high resolution, which gives you a 2x scaling. And if you have a game that works really well by seeing only one of the screens, like Mario Kart DS, you can do that as well. Overall, Nintendo DS is really good on this. Unfortunately, Nintendo 3DS is a different story. This is using the standalone Citra emulator, which is a free emulator on the App Store. And honestly, I couldn't find a single 3DS game that played at full speed. So unfortunately, 3DS is not very good. But you know what is really good is PSP. You can play this at 3x resolution, which is a 720p signal, and it works really well. Like, look at Outrun 2006, one of the harder games to play on PSP. It's eating up 3x resolution like a champ. There are no issues here when it comes to playing this game. It's actually quite a delight to play these games at 3x resolution. They look really good and they perform really well. Honestly, this is a great argument for all the people who say, just get a PS Vita, it can do everything. And sure, a PS Vita can play PSP games, but it cannot play them at 2x or even 3x resolution. These look so much better than they do on the PS Vita. And given the fact that they play at a 3x resolution, it's a really nice experience. Not everything's going to play at 3x. For example, God of War games need to be played at 2x. But even at 2x resolution with a 5.5-inch screen like this, it still looks much better than the PS Vita. You do get a bit of slowdown here and there with this game in particular, but overall it's a smooth experience. If you're looking for good PSP, this is the best handheld you can buy in terms of performance for under $200. So let's move on to another system. How about Nintendo 64? I always like to start with F-Zero X, and it's playing beautifully. This is at 720p resolution again, and it's running at full speed. No problems when it comes to performance with this game at all. Moving it up a notch, here's Cruisin' USA. This is also playing at a good frame rate. It does dip down every once in a while, but overall a smooth experience. And GoldenEye plays pretty well too. Not at 100% full speed, but still relatively smooth. But it's not a fun experience. In fact, GoldenEye has a completely different issue altogether. And I think now is a good time to talk about the practicality of these controls. On my unit, the trigger buttons are terrible. The left trigger is basically unusable. As you can see here, it gets stuck when I start playing it. And this is really, really frustrating. When you're in the heat of the moment trying to play a game, the last thing you want to do is to have a button stick down and all of a sudden just start pressing a bunch of times. And this is what's happening when I'm trying to play GoldenEye. I don't even have to push down the button, it's just firing my gun. And even though the R2 button doesn't stick, it's not that much better anyway. These two trigger buttons are frustratingly bad. And so how do we work around this? Number one, we could remap the buttons in the emulator themselves, but also we could try out this screen mapping tool. So you press the G button and then you move around the functions, and then that's basically how it works. So I'm going to move the trigger over to L1 instead of L2. And so there we go, now I can actually use the shoulder button to fire the gun, and that's a much better experience. Of course, if you're going to use button mapping, it's going to keep all the controls on screen, which is a little bit annoying, but overall this is a better solution than having to use the trigger buttons. But make no mistake about it, if you're going to use any game that requires trigger buttons, you're not going to have a good time. Okay, let's move over to Dreamcast now. We're going to update the resolution here. We're going to double it to 1280 by 960. And it works wonderfully. We're using the Redream emulator here, and the gameplay is very smooth. In fact, the gameplay is so smooth that performance becomes an afterthought, and this is really my goal anytime I try to do any sort of emulation. I want to be able to play a game and not have to look at the frame rate, and just be confident that it's going to play at full speed. And luckily, or should I say wonderfully, this experience is exactly that on Sega Dreamcast. It works really well. Well, it works really well for anything that doesn't require diagonals. Here you can see with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, I can't even pull off a Hadouken. Basically any move that requires a diagonal just doesn't work for me. So I have two options here. I can either just not play fighting games, or you'll have to resort to using the analog stick. And I know there's a lot of people out there who prefer analog sticks, so this may not be an issue for you, but for me, I'm a D-pad kind of guy, and this was really frustrating. Alright, let's move over to the star of the show, the one that everyone wants to know about, and that's Nintendo GameCube. And I'm happy to confirm that yes, several Nintendo GameCube games can work on this device. You have several different options when it comes to emulators. You have the official emulator on the Android Play Store, as well as MMJR and MMJR2. And all of these are tested with MMJR. And as you can see, the lower end games do play really well. Everything basically up to Soul Calibur 2. The first game that encountered a lot of slowdown was actually Wind Waker. For the most part, the game ran smoothly, but anytime there were other characters on screen, it would slow down things quite a bit. So it really comes down to personal preference. Are you willing to live with a little bit of slowdown in order to play Wind Waker on a portable device? That's going to be up to you. Either way, despite the slowdown, this game looks beautiful on this screen. Of course, if you try some of the harder to run games, F-Zero GX, it's just not going to be worth it. Overall, I would say about 50% of Nintendo GameCube games are going to be at least somewhat playable, and a good 25% of them are going to run really well. But the other factor to consider, besides just performance, is whether or not you're even going to want to play the game in the first place. A good example for this is Super Mario Sunshine. I had a really hard time playing this game. 1, the analog sticks were way too sensitive. 2, I hated having to use the triggers on the back. And 3, the face buttons are not very good either. And it's just unfortunate. Here I am, finally with a device that can portably play Super Mario Sunshine fairly well, and I honestly didn't want to do it, because the games just aren't very fun to play. I'm a stickler for good controls, and to be honest, these controls are pretty lousy. It made it so that I didn't enjoy this experience. And that's really unfortunate given the power of this device. Now, I chose not to play any PS2 games on this device, and that's a personal choice. Basically, I just don't feel good using the Daemon PS2 emulator because it uses stolen code. And so because of that, I chose not to test it. But luckily, there are others in the community who have tested PS2, and a Brazilian YouTuber named Victor Yemeni, he gave me permission to show off some of his footage on my channel here. So I'd recommend checking out his channel if you want to see more footage, but overall you can see here that some of the games work pretty well. In particular, Kingdom Hearts basically runs at full speed, and it looks like other games like Final Fantasy X are working pretty well too. A little bit of slowdown, but overall PS2 seems to be working on some games. Now this is just a handful of games. So far I've heard about 5, maybe 10 games that run at full speed. So don't get your hopes up when it comes to PS2. Okay, moving over to Android gaming, it works just fine. These games run really well. I didn't test Genshin Impact because it has a 13 gigabyte download file, and who's got time for that? But either way, you can see that Android games play pretty well. I wouldn't expect any less. And there was no way I'm going to play Call of Duty with these trigger buttons, but either way, you can see that Android games play pretty well. I would just stick to things like racing games, things that don't require triggers. A couple other things I did try are things like Google Stadia. As you saw in my intro, Destiny 2 was playing just fine through Stadia, but you can also stream other PC games directly onto your device. So this is pretty handy if you want to play some PC games without owning a PC or installing anything onto your device. So I also tried out some other streaming options. For example, Xbox streaming is very smooth. And all of the buttons seem to work well other than the L2 and R2 buttons. Xbox doesn't even register when you push down on them. And given the fact that the trigger buttons are basically fundamental to Xbox gaming, I don't think this is going to be a viable option. Now, the official PS4 Android app actually doesn't register any of the controls, which is what I was expecting. The touchscreen controls do work, and it seems to be pretty smooth, but overall, you're either going to have to use a third-party app like Chiaki, or you're going to have to pair a PS4 controller to the device itself, and that doesn't make any sense to me, because you might as well just use a phone then. PC streaming also works. This is me using Parsec here. I'm streaming it from my PC running a Wii U emulator. And the gameplay is relatively smooth. The picture itself is kind of blocky and pixelated, but otherwise it runs smoothly. So if you want to do PC streaming via Moonlight or Steam Link, those are all options as well. Alright, we've been at this forever, so let's go ahead and start wrapping up. Let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about this device. We'll start with what I like. Number one, the power versus price. For $175 or less, this is a really powerful machine. You can play Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PSP all upscaled to 720p, and you can play about half of the GameCube catalog. Given that it's an Android-based operating system, it's fairly customizable. You can create your own front ends and have a gaming experience however you want based on Android. I really like the run-ahead feature on RetroArch. It does make the games feel really responsive. This is really good for 8-bit and 16-bit gameplay. The 5.5-inch touchscreen display on this device is really good. It's one of the best I've seen on a retro handheld. And I like that it's a clamshell. This is a mostly portable device. You can just close it up and take it with you, and that's a really nice feature for me. This is something I can just take around with me and maybe beat up the outside of it without worrying about cracking my screen. So those are the things I like about this device. Now let's take some time and talk about what I don't like about the X18S. If it's not already very apparent to you, I don't like the controls on this device. The D-pad, the face buttons, the triggers, and the analog sticks, all of them have significant faults to them. I've had this device for about a week now, and I was hoping that I would adjust to them, but to be honest, I have not. I'm still weighing whether or not this is a deal breaker for me, but all the same, it's definitely not enjoyable. On top of that, the device over time becomes uncomfortable. It's basically like playing a grilled cheese sandwich. You're holding this thing and it's just flat and just nondescript. And I get it, this is not meant to be something that's super ergonomic. But all the same, I feel like they could have used better design choices to make this fit better in the hand. The stock firmware just kind of sucks on this device. You can tweak it a little bit, but overall I'm waiting for custom firmware. And the Android 11 that's on this device just makes things like file management really tricky. It's not impossible, but it will take you time to get everything squared away so that you can play this optimally. Overall, if I had to summarize the experience, I would say that this device holds itself back. It's a powerful device. This thing can play all of the classics as well as up to GameCube. It's really impressive. The problem is that these bad buttons, the D-pad, the face button, the analog sticks, and even the triggers, make it so that I kind of don't want to play this thing. And that's really unfortunate. I want to be able to walk by this thing sitting on my desk and just want to grab it and pick it up and play. And that happens with several devices that I already own. These are things that happen with the RGB10 Max, as well as the Anbernic RG280V. But unfortunately, I don't have that same experience with the PowKiddy X18S. And really, let me splash a little bit of cold water on this whole experience. This is the first next-generation device available for retro handhelds. We've got others coming. The Odin is on its way later on this year. I expect the next Anbernic device to come out before the end of the year as well. We've got options coming. And so consider this like maybe the first Odroid Go Advance. It was the first device to have the RK3326 chipset, and over the course of almost 2 years since it was first released, we've seen a ton of different clones come out. So I don't think it's the end of the world. This is a great start when it comes to the next generation of handheld emulators. But we can't expect some of these smaller companies to knock it out of the park on day one. I'm hoping that over time they're going to address some of the issues that I found in this video here. Maybe they'll upgrade the hardware on the current device, or they'll release a new device with the same chipset. Either way, we're going to have options here in the future. Now, should you buy the PowKiddy X18S right now? Honestly, that's really going to depend on you. The way I'm looking at it, this is something like a project device. I bet that some of the early adopters and the enthusiasts in the community who buy this device are going to figure out ways to make the controls a little bit better. And I'm going to explore those options as well. I'm going to take this thing apart. I'm going to see what I can do to make it a better experience. But if you're the kind of person who just wants to open up a device and start playing immediately, I would say you're probably going to want to wait for something different. Out of the box, I kind of don't think this device is worth it, even though it has very powerful performance and a great screen for under $175. Because the truth is, what good is a screen and performance if you don't actually want to play it? And that's kind of where I stand with this device right now. Now, I do reserve the right to change my mind in case we have better custom firmware, as well as fixes for the controls themselves. But for now, I would say keep this on your radar in case it gets to a really good sale price. Hold the money in your wallet until you see something better in the future. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. Thanks for sticking around and watching. I know this was a long one, but I hope I covered all the things you were hoping to hear about this device. If you could do me a favor and leave a like and subscribe, that would really help me out. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.